Hi, baby boomer fans. We are Jackie and Janine, the Pfeiffer sisters, and love to talk about the 1950s, inviting you to reminisce with us as we explore experiences of that decade. Grab your favorite malt or Green River. Make sure you are wide awake and get ready to be inspired about the 1950s. Welcome to the 1950s Fun Chat. Hello, folks. Thank you for joining us today. We're just delighted that you choose to be a part of our 1950s Fun Chats and learn more about the history of that wonderful decade. Today, April 1st, this is not an April Fool's joke. We have an authentic, wonderful guest with us who's going to talk about a special event, special place, special occurrence that we think will bring you much delight and much interest. Right, Jackie?
You bet. So, folks, you know the rule. If the drill, if you've been watching this, I point your attention towards the lower purple banner. www.whilethewindmillwatch.com is where you'll find all sorts of information about the book and the vendors that we have selling the book, about the authors, and about this 1950s Fun Chat. You are able to go there to see the previous chats. This is number 134 today. And at the end of the month, this one and a previous one will be put on our Fun Chat page. So, but there are so many more to look at. So next, also,
when we talk about the book, maybe people don't know that you and I authored that book.
Well, maybe they don't. We're going to tell you right now, though. See, the whilethewindmillwatch.com is our website that tells about the book, which you can see up in the upper right-hand corner. That is While the Windmill Watched, a slice of rural America in the 1950s. It's a modern history book, among other things. And you see the beautiful North Dakota sunset, and it wraps around the book. And, of course, the silhouette of our windmill that was in our yard and the two little girls. And you'll also notice a little white spot down there, and that indicates this book was the 2022 National Independent Press Award in the regional nonfiction category as the distinguished favorite. So we are happy to have that little icon on the front of it. Today, though, the 1950s Fun Chat, as you may or may not know, has evolved from chatting with guests who were born in the 1950s to guests being influenced by the 1950s, to educating ourselves and our audience with a variety of topics, having influence before, during, and after the 1950s. So I begin with this query. How does a degree in biology lead to being an executive director of the National Pearl Button Museum? Perhaps by the end of the chat, you, the viewer, will be able to see the relationship of one to the other. So we introduce you to Dustin Joy. Dustin Joy was born in 1968. He's been married to his wife, Melissa, for 32 years. They have 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. The Joys live on a farm in rural western Illinois, where Dustin enjoys writing, gardening, fishing, and visiting museums. Dustin is a graduate of Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, with a BA in biology. Dustin came to his current job via an admittedly unusual route after 25 years as an airline pilot for Trans-States Airlines. Dustin, we welcome you to the 1950s Fun Chat.
Thank you. Nice to be here. I'm glad you invited me.
Why, thank you. Before we delve into your main topic, we are curious to know, from the decade of the 1950s, what has influenced your life?
Well, I always think of the 1950s as sort of a easier, more peaceful, more maybe sane time than we live in today. Of course, that all followed a very tumultuous era during the war. My aunt is could almost run your website too, because she loves the 1950s and always is regaling me with wonderful things from that era, cars and things that experiences she had in the 50s. Now the 50s were the beginning of a lot of things. I guess my connection with my museum will be it kind of represented the end of some things here with the pearl button industry in Muscatine. That was starting to be toward the end of it, but it did bring in a lot of changes to the community here, which ultimately were probably for the good, and it diversified the economy here, these changes.
Mm-hmm. So before we delve, here's a convoluted question, sort of, which will probably yield a long answer. How does a degree in biology via 26 years as an airline pilot lead to pearl buttons?
Yeah, I get that question a lot. Knox College, if anybody's ever heard of it, is a small liberal arts college in Western Illinois also. And I guess I really embrace the liberal arts, which is to say I never could decide what I wanted to do when I grew up. I was very interested in biology. I worked in a biology lab in college. I got to work with a great professor there. When I graduated, I had the opportunity, however, to go to work on my father-in-law's hog farm. And I did that for about 3 years. And then I got interested in working on my private pilot license. And that led me to think that maybe I could do that for a living. It sounds like I changed a lot, but I did stick with flying for about 25 years. But all the time I was traveling, I was always going to museums, and I've been to just about every one in the lower 48 you can think of.
Oh my.
I've been to the Salt and Pepper Shaker Museum. I've been to the Erie Canal Museum. I've been to the Transportation Museum in Roanoke, Virginia, and every small museum around. And having lived across the river from this museum, I've always admired it, and I thought it was really well done. And then came 2020, and that's about all I need to say probably for most of you. My airline, TransStates, was one of the 3 that went completely out of business in 2020 following the COVID epidemic began. So basically, I was looking for a job at that point, and I had done this flying long enough and lived in hotel rooms long enough and missed my family enough that I thought, if I have to restart over, basically, I'm going to do something that is important to me and that I value and is interesting to me. And right then, serendipitously, this job came open. And I thought, well, you know what? I'm going to give it a try. I won't blame them at all if they don't want to hire a pilot to run their museum, because I have no experience with that. But I must write a good cover letter because they gave me an interview and apparently thought that it was worth a risk. And I've been here for 3.5 years now. I really enjoy it. The work is interesting to me, and it varies a lot. I mean, my day-to-day activity can be meeting the mayor to talk about, city council things, or writing a grant proposal, or cleaning the toilets, because we are a small museum. I'm the only full-time staff currently, and we do have 2 ladies that run the gift shop and act as docents. So I get to do a little bit of everything, and no 2 days are the same.
Oh, wonderful.
The National Pearl Button Museum, when I first saw that online, and I do not recall how I first learned about it, and at Muscatine, Iowa, I thought, man, there's a story there that we need to share. And particularly so since Jackie and I are seamstresses, and I anyway, was a dedicated seamstress back in the 50s. We both were, because that's the only way that we got the wardrobe that we had to wear. And we used many buttons back then. But Dustin, start us on the journey of the National Button Museum and how it came about to be in Muscatine.
Muscatine is often called the pearl button capital of the world. It's often called the Pearl City. That sounds like a Chamber of Commerce propaganda, but it really defined this town. The production of these pearl buttons, Muscatine actually made about 1/3 of all the pearl buttons ever made in the world. They, at the peak of production, which was in 1905, they were making 1.5 billion buttons a year. That's an abstract number until you do the math on it and realize that buttons being 1/8 of an inch thick, that's a stack of buttons about 2,900 miles high.
Oh,
Okay.
And they did this every year for many years. That's interesting that a little town could have that kind of production. We were about 12 or 15,000 people at that time. But to me, what's really interesting is what they made these from. And these buttons were made from freshwater mussel shells pulled out of the Mississippi and other tributary rivers. These real living creatures, they pulled them out of the river, boiled them out of their shells, drilled holes in their shells to make these little things called button blanks. And then they would manufacture buttons out of them. It had a huge impact on the economy here. Virtually every family was engaged in this activity at one time or another. They estimate that more than half of the workforce worked in the button industry. It also had a huge impact on the environment here because these were real living creatures and they were actually filter feeders, which means they suck in water and filter out food and oxygen and then spit that water back out cleaner than it was. So if you extrapolate the hundreds of millions of mussels they removed from the river every year, it had a big impact on water quality, and it obviously did a real number on the populations of freshwater mussels in this country.
Dustin, what was the radius of area in which the mussels could be harvested from Muscatine?
Right. I guess I'll first say why this is centered here in the first place. It's obviously because the river's here, and it's obviously because this was an area with plentiful freshwater mussels. But it really comes down to one gentleman, a guy named John Beppel. He was a German immigrant. He lived in Ottensen, Germany, which is near Hamburg. He had been making buttons over there with this process, which ultimately is how they made them here. But he found it harder and harder to get the shells he needed for the production. And he immigrated to the U.S. Somebody from his family had received one of these freshwater mussel shells from around here. All he knew for sure was that it was from a river about 200 miles west of Chicago. And he moved here, took a leap of faith, ultimately ended up in Muscatine because he had heard this is where these shells were plentiful. And he started a little shop here, making buttons the old-fashioned way, the way he had always made them with his foot-powered lathe. And these were a status symbol then. They were like a piece of jewelry. If you were wealthy, you had pearl buttons on your clothes. If you were poor, you had wood or something else. So he took these shells from the river, made buttons, and sold them for a pretty good price. He made the first buttons here in 1891. 14 years later, they're making 1.5 billion a year, and there are 24 factories running night and day making buttons. So when somebody figures out how to make money, other people see that and they figure out how they can do it too. So the industry became centered here in Muscatine because of this one man starting up his business here. And then your question was, how far afield did they go? Well, ultimately, as they wiped out mussel populations in local areas, they had to go further and further away. And I wish I could project this map, but we have a map from a 1919 fisheries study where they showed all the places they were harvested for the Muscatine button industry. And they were harvesting mussels clear out in Pennsylvania, clear down to the Gulf Coast, all the way up in North Dakota and Minnesota, and all the way west into the into Nebraska and Kansas. Originally, they would ship the whole shell to Muscatine and drill holes in it. But eventually they figured out that if the average shell produced 4 or 5 buttons, it didn't make sense to ship all that weight here. So they started these little regional button factories all around this area, and they would drill out the blanks. So these were all 1.5 billion were drilled one at a time with a hole saw. And they would ship these blanks then to Muscatine for processing. And these local blanking shops, as they called them, were all over the Midwest. There's Lake Pepin, Wisconsin, Keysburg, Illinois, down into Paducah, Kentucky on the Ohio River. I talked to a guy from New Ulm, Minnesota a while back that runs a museum there, and they had found some of these shells with the drilled out holes that we call spent shells.
Okay. Interestingly, the buttons, these mussels, didn't just have a habitat in the Mississippi River. They were in other rivers in our country.
Yeah, just about any flowing body of water, and even some lakes and reservoirs. Yep.
Wow. Okay. So then this was in the early 1891, early 1900s. Then take us on a progression coming up into the 50s.
It was a trajectory. So this climbed very fast. Again, Beppels made the first buttons in 1891. 1905, they're making 1.5 billion a year. By 1910, they realize they have a problem. These mussels don't grow very fast. They have an interesting reproductive cycle that requires a fish as a host, a parasitic host during part of their life cycle. And they just don't grow fast enough. A shell this big might be 50 years old. So, so by 1910, they know they have a problem. They're already, people are moving farther and farther away from Muscatine for harvesting. And the U.S. government, fishery service, and the button industry got together, and they started what is now called the Fairport Fish Hatchery. At that time, it was the Fairport Biological Station, about 10 miles upriver from here. And they wanted to find out, how do these things live? What do they eat? How do they reproduce? And can we put them back in the rivers to keep this industry going? Unfortunately, the rate of harvest was such that it was never going to work, but they learned a lot about these creatures and how they live. And I'm sorry.
When you're talking about a rate of harvest, are you talking months or years for a mussel to be harvested?
Yeah, so, you could go out in the river today and find freshwater mussels, and some are little because they're young, and hopefully, especially now that they're mostly protected, you could find some pretty big ones too. But since they reproduce slowly and they grow so slowly, at the rate they were pulling them out of the river, they couldn't reproduce fast enough, couldn't grow fast enough. So they realized by about 1910 that this was going to be a problem ultimately. And the solution ultimately was they just went farther and farther away to catch them. But even those sites petered out over time, and the price of shells went up, up, up. So what really changed in the 1950s was due to the war effort. And in the 1940s, there was a lot of research in chemical technology because of the war effort. And that resulted in better plastics than we'd had before. They'd always had things like Bakelite, which was kind of brittle, not really suitable to the purpose. But when they developed better plastics going into the 1950s, the economics of that, did I lose you?
We can still see you.
Okay. Something jumped up on my computer, I guess.
Okay.
But in the 1950s, the economics of making plastic buttons overwhelmed the economics of having somebody row a boat out on a river and harvest a mussel and drill a hole in it and haul it to Muscatine. So any company in Muscatine that survived past the 1950s had started this switch over to plastic buttons. And some of them lasted a long time. We have three companies. The last three button makers in Muscatine were the Weber Company, the McKee Company, and J&K Button. And they all made buttons till the year 2019. But after about 1960, they were all making plastic buttons, and the era of the pearl button had ended here.
Okay. How did these buttons get moved or transported to the retail industry? How did that work in the Muscatine area?
Yeah, they sold buttons in two ways. They sold them on a wholesale basis to big textile manufacturers. So, your Berkshire Hathaway's making shirts before Berkshire Hathaway was an investment company. It was actually a shirt factory. And these traveling salesmen from Muscatine would go out to New York and New England, where they had these textile mills, and they would take their display cards and try to sell these companies thousands of buttons. And they were always sold by the gross, 144, 12 dozen. I don't know where that standard developed, but that was always how they were. So they would sell boxes of buttons, 5 gross, 10 gross, 100 gross. The other way they were sold is on a retail basis. So you could go to the equivalent of Walmart or whatever back then, and they would have these buttons sewn onto cards.
With thread. Hand sewn?
Originally, they were all hand sewn. So that was yet another way people made a living in Muscatine as kind of a side project to the button industry. People would go to the button factories, get buttons, get cards, take them home and sew them onto the cards at night, return them to the factory. And the price I always heard was if you sewed 5 cards of 12 buttons each, you got a penny. So if you've sewn even one button on a shirt, you know that's inadequate pay for that kind of work.
Yes. Okay. Just a side business, right? In your home.
You could buy these buttons on cards, and they all had graphic designs, which were really interesting. You can look at them. You can buy these. These went from collector's items or status symbols to commodities that everybody had. And then now they're back to being collectibles. And in fact, I'm giving a little speech to the National Button Society next week. And they have thousands of members, all who are eager to collect all sorts of buttons, all sorts of designs. And certainly these pearl buttons are treasured now.
Yes.
So tell me about the National Button Society. What does that, are they collectors? What does that mean?
Right. They are collectors, and it's a big deal. It's a lot bigger deal than I ever knew before I took this job, but they have thousands of members. The lady who's organizing my speech is she lives in Ottawa, Ontario, Canada. The president lives in San Diego, and they're all over the country. And these are people who are enthusiastic about these really interesting and unique items, and they are unique. I give a speech about the button industry, and the title is 1.5 billion, everyone unique. And the reason is because each and every one of these pearl buttons came from a different shell. So the button you hold up may come from the Ohio River near Kentucky, and then this next button might come from a black sand shell harvested in Lake Pepin in Wisconsin, and this next one might be from a washboard mussel from the Mississippi at Muscatine. And every single one, this mother of pearl that it's made of, is unique. It looks different because it was laid down by a different age, size, type of mussel.
Sure.
And they're beautiful. They really are beautiful. It's hard to do them justice in a picture, but they each one is unique, and they have this amazing vivid shimmer to them. And that actually surprisingly goes down to the atomic level. They're made of a compound called nacre, which is a form of calcium carbonate. And the way nacre is laid down on the shell in these little layers, the layers are about the same thickness as the wavelength of natural white light. And that's what makes them shimmer.
Wow. Would it be correct to say that buttons were of different sizes when they were drilled out, or were they mostly shirt buttons?
Certainly the half-inch shirt buttons were the dominant sale, but they made so many different kinds. It's really astounding. I mean, they had large buttons, 3 and 4 inches for ladies' dresses or winter coats. They had belt buckles, which were formed from these shells, and they had lots of different sizes in between. And we say that the average shirt button would have taken about 30 handlings from the time it was pulled out of the river to the time it was packed in a box and sent off. But they also made buttons with floral designs. And remember, there were no computer-aided drafting or CNC machining or anything like that.
Mhm.
So everything that was done to make a flower pattern or a spiral or anything like that had to be done individually with a grinder and had to be indexed in just such a way. And anything they did with these machines had to be done with gears and cams and pulleys and belts.
Mm.
Can I show you just a few pictures of some of that?
Yes, please do.
Or would you rather wait till later on that?
Oh,
No, and I do maybe before we get to, I do have a couple questions about the merchandising of the buttons. So they would go by the boxfuls to wholesalers. So Jackie and I, in the 50s, Jackie and I were seamstresses. We would go get our fabrics and sewing notions from the Bismarck, North Dakota J.C. Penney store, or Mrs. Blow's sewing center in Fargo, North Dakota, and later on when we went to school there. We would find buttons on cards. At that particular time in the 60s, would we still have been able to find pearl buttons at these small sewing centers?
Certainly in the 50s you could, and probably through most of the 60s as well. And if you did, they were undoubtedly from Muscatine or one of the companies associated with Muscatine.
Okay.
I just read an article the other day about one of the factories that continued to market pearl buttons into the 1980s, but they had these were not backlogs, but they were buttons they had found in storage because production of the pearl buttons had ended. But I found a catalog dated 1982 that had a certain number of pearl buttons that you could buy. So I'm sure if you found some in North Dakota in the 1950s or 60s, they were probably from Muscatine and very likely could have been pearl buttons.
And in that era of the 1950s, there were a noticeable number of door-to-door salesmen, whether it be for vacuum cleaners or Watkins products or whoever. Were there door-to-door button salespeople? And I'm particularly thinking so because so many women then were seamstresses. So was it easier for them to make a sale had they gone to a homemaker door-to-door?
I don't know the answer to that. I wish I did. I do know that the traveling salesmen I spoke of that sold wholesale, they did travel all over the country to different manufacturers. But as far as going door to door in homes, you're right. It sounds like a logical extension of the Fuller Brush concept or whatever, especially since many people made their own clothes in that era. I always am tickled to hear people say, my grandma had a can of or a jar of buttons. Everybody did because they saved them. When they clothes wore out, they cut the buttons off. So they were treated with a little more respect or a little more valued than we treat plastic buttons today.
Well, and perhaps with the advent of a zipper or Velcro and other types of closures, hooks and eyes, snaps, that a button might not have been used as much for clothing versus maybe what we see other applications for closures now.
Yeah, we talk about the button industry fading out because of supply and demand, the pearl button industry, that is. But there were also more and more of these other fasteners being used. We think of zippers always being around, but of course they weren't, and they weren't always widely used. So that all these things kind of work together to displace the use of pearl buttons. Also, we have an old Maytag washing machine, the old kind that had a gasoline engine on it, on display here. And the reason is because these were very popular and they had ringers, which was a new concept. And the ringers, as well as mangling people once in a while, also broke pearl buttons, but plastic buttons could survive. So it was just another strike against the pearl button ultimately.
So I have a question, and that is, did pearl buttons ever have a shank, or did that happen when plastic started?
They did. We have quite a few that are like that. And that was also a complicated manufacturing process because they had to drill a hole halfway through the button. Well, that's a lot harder than drilling a hole all the way through. If you think about management of the distance and travel, they would drill halfway through. A lot of the shanks had a kind of a flange, and it would be pressed into the hole, and then friction would hold it in place. But a lot of them were also glued into the hole. So that means we have videos of people working in these factories in the 1950s, holding a tube of glue in one hand and a button in the other. So to say that this was a lot of manual dexterity work was an understatement.
Yes, yes. Well, think of all these different button collections out there. Some hiding in the trunk of Grandma's trunk in the attic, or some in other closets. That, there could be just awesome finds of pearl buttons in those.
Yeah. So now folks know maybe you'd like to have a donation of old buttons, and they can contact you about that.
Absolutely. Our website is www.muscatinehistory.org.
Okay.
And my email is dustin@muscatinehistory.org. And we would entertain any donations of money or otherwise to keep us going. We think this is a great museum. I think people are always pleasantly surprised because most people don't know what to think. They don't know what to expect, what a button museum will be. And frequently I say, we see usually the lady dragging her husband in because he doesn't see a button museum. And then frequently they're dragging him back out because he gets interested maybe in the buttons, maybe in the manufacturing, maybe in the muscles and the biology of them. So I say we're kind of a sleeper museum. I think everybody who walks out of here finds that it was worth their time and that it's very interesting.
Dustin, tell us about the hours that you're open at the museum.
Yeah, we're open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. In the winter, January and February, we're only open Fridays and Saturday. But the rest of the year, we're open 5 days. Okay.
Do you give tours through your museum, or is it pretty much individuals can walk through?
You can do it either way, but I would say if you make the trek to Muscatine to see our museum, ask for the tour, and specifically ask Veda or Eileen for the tour. They know this history better than anybody, and they will tell you all the neat, interesting stories about the industry and how it developed. You will not be disappointed. We're also one of the Great River Road interpretive centers. We're right on the Great River Road. And so if you happen to be driving the Great River Road from Minnesota down to New Orleans, stop in. We're right on the way. And we have all the brochures and manuals for travel on the Great River Road tours.
Wonderful. So let's see those photos.
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to show you, this is our museum.
What an attractive front. And so is this in downtown Muscatine?
It is. We're about 1 block from the Mississippi River on 2nd Street. And this was an old Montgomery Ward's. It's conveniently located. Most people think it must have been an old button factory because there were so many here, but it actually was a department store.
Is it one layer?
No, we have 2 levels, and our basement is stocked with all sorts of buttons too.
And speaking of basements, do you ever have any flooding since you're so close to the river?
We don't. There's enough elevation rise between us and the river, so that 1 block really makes a difference because 1 block away they do get flooded, but we're pretty lucky to be somewhat up on the hill here.
Okay.
Dustin, can people purchase anything at the museum? Oh, that's interesting.
They sure can. We have a gift shop, and most everything in our gift shop is made from or pertains to pearl buttons or mother of pearl or even pearls. A lot of our art and jewelry is made by local artists here who turn buttons into amazing things. Veda Baker, who I mentioned before, is our gift shop manager, and she's also what I call our artist in residence. These wonderful fish that are above our mussel exhibit were made by her. The picture does not do them justice. That trout is about 6 feet long, and it's made from cardboard and buttons, and it's just really impressive. So yeah, we definitely have interesting things to buy, and you can even buy pearl buttons. We don't sell any of ours because they're artifacts, but one of the companies that bought one of the factories when they closed down discovered their whole basement was full of pearl buttons, and so they're selling some on consignment.
Nice. So you've been mentioning pearls all the time. Every several thousand mussels, do they produce a pearl?
Yes, about freshwater mussels are mollusks, just like clams and oysters, and about 1 in 100 freshwater mussels will produce some kind of pearl. Sometimes they're perfect round white jewel quality pearls, and more often than not, they're eccentric shape, or maybe they're a little bit of a yellowish color. Those were called slugs by the clammers who harvested them, but the marketing people have come up with the term Baroque pearls, if you've ever heard that term, for eccentric or not quite perfectly round pearls. But these people who harvested the mussels for a living were always called clammers, even though these are mussels. Everybody around here calls these creatures clams. And the people who did this for a living were called clammers. And if you were harvesting mussels for the button industry, you were also watching out for pearls, because about 1 in 100 had some kind of pearl. And if you found a large one, that could make your whole income for the summer.
Oh my. Oh, good.
Yeah.
So let me show you just a few of the pictures of the production facilities back in the day. After harvesting, these mussels were soaked in big tanks of water.
There we go.
Like
that. Oh, okay.
That was to soften them and to keep down the dust ultimately when they were manufactured. The next step in the process was what they called blanking. And these guys are standing at blanking machines, and basically they're horizontal hole saws. So they would hold the shell up with a pair of metal tongs, and they would drill holes in them one at a time. So,
Yep.
They would drill holes in them one at a time, and these blanks, these donut holes, would become the buttons. The first step was to grind them, because since each and every one was a little different, these ladies here, you can see, are putting blanks one at a time into a leather belt, and that would drag it under a grinding wheel. Each and every blank is unique, because not only does it come from a different size, shape, and age of mussel, but different parts of the shell will yield a different shaped blank. So they had to grind these things on both sides to make them the same diameter and the same thickness. And then they would use a machine like this. This is called a double automatic, and it's a little hard to see in the photo, but the operator would sit there all day long and put these button blanks into these collets as they moved by. They would shape the top of the button, and then as they came around the other side, they would drill holes in the button to make it into a finished button.
You talked about each button very unique in its look. If someone was looking to find 6 matched buttons, would that be difficult to do?
Well, in fact, that was the job of some people in the factory. These ladies.
Let me get you on full view again here, so we can see that. Okay, there we go.
So these ladies are sorters, and they would sit all day long at these sorting tables, and people would bring them buckets of buttons from the manufacturing process and dump them on their table, and they would sit there all day long and sort these into as many as 15 different grades, mostly determined by the color of the button produced. And so ultimately what went to the manufacturers of clothing were matched buttons, because if you sent them a whole batch of buttons with 10 different colors in it, they probably wouldn't like that. So this sorting was very necessary and a very tedious job. I think it would be the worst job in the factory to sit there all day and sort.
And they'd have to sitting in those uncomfortable wooden chairs without any cushions. Oh, it'd be hard on your back and your legs and your mind.
And you'll notice.
Was there an odor to the buttons?
Very definitely.
Oh.
We think that the town must have really smelled pretty rich. As you can imagine, these are shellfish.
Yeah.
And just the other day, in fact, I was preparing some shells for a display here, and I discovered it still had a little bit of the soft muscle tissue from the mussel that had all dried out like leather. But you can imagine when it was much fresher, they probably smelled a little bit.
Yes. Yeah.
But you probably noticed a lot of these pictures featured women. And when I first came here, I thought, gosh, most of the pictures in the plants showed women. Was that during the war or something? But it wasn't. It was really, there were many, many women that worked in this industry. And there were certain tasks which they were almost uniquely assigned. The sorting of buttons, almost all women. A lot of these machines where it required manual dexterity and judgment and so forth, it was women running them. But what I think is kind of ridiculous is you see some of the outfits they had to wear, and they're wearing these long dresses.
Yes.
Yeah.
And, in the case of some of these machines, they have these long skirts right next to these gears and belts and flying spindles and things. I have to imagine that there were a lot of injuries and problems with that. But there was no OSHA to take care of that sort of thing back then.
No.
Did children work in the plants too?
Yeah, they did. In fact, a lot of this transport of buttons were done by what they called bucket boys, who would go to the production machines and get the buttons and take them to the sorting room. I didn't mention, they were not only sorting them by color, but there were a lot of damaged buttons. This is a hard material to work with. It's a brittle material. And so all through the process, there's opportunities for cracks and chips and so forth. So they would sort out damaged buttons and remove those from the process. So that's your quality control. And they just dumped those all over Muscatine, all over the area. Had a guy from Moscow, Iowa, which is west of us, come in last summer, and he puts up purple martin birds. And he discovered last fall that the purple martin boxes were full of buttons, and he couldn't figure this out. Well, some factory here had just dumped a bunch of them out in a rural dump or something, and the birds had found them, and for whatever inscrutable reason had decided to collect them and filled their houses up with them. But even today, these buttons and certainly what we call spent shells are all over Muscatine. So that's the shells with holes drilled in them.
And were any of those shells used, the spent shells used for other purposes?
Yes. The meat of the mussel was mostly wasted because they just pulled it out and threw it back in the river because they really didn't have any way to preserve it, even if they wanted to use it as a food source or something. But the shells, after they were drilled out in Muscatine, they were ground up to use like gravel and road building materials. Pretty much if you dug a hole 2 feet or more deep in Muscatine, anywhere you wanted to, you'd find these spent shells. They built roads out of them. They dumped them all over the place. There was a company that ground them up fine to make marking powder for athletic fields. There was a company that ground them up to make chicken feed additive like they use oyster shell now. One of the most interesting things they did with these shells, there was a company in Japan that developed a process of making cultured pearls. And they found the best seed pellet they could use to make these cultured pearls was a little round pellet made from a freshwater mussel shell from the Midwest. And they would ship these to Japan. The workers would insert them into the body of an oyster and then put it back down in the ocean. and the oyster would continue to cover it with nacre and make a cultured pearl. That's where the term cultured pearl comes from.
Oh,
Interesting. So interesting. And I can see by listening to this that you started out in biology, then you flew around a little bit, and then you came back to biology with a different kind of study.
I think they're interesting. This museum has several different facets. Like I said, it has something that I think interests most people. And, one thing when I first started here was I wanted to beef up our mussel exhibit, because I think that's kind of the foundation of why this industry was here. So I worked with some Iowa DNR folks and some people from U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and we built this mussel exhibit that talks about what mussels are, why mussels matter, and talk a little bit about their conservation over time, because there's so many of these natural resource stories where people don't know what they have. They don't know when these things are plentiful. Yeah, let's use them all as quickly as we can. But then we learn later down the road that there are ramifications to that. And so this is kind of interesting to me, these mussels. Even today, we see the results of some of these things. Just in November, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service delisted 21 species from the endangered species list because they were presumed to be extinct. Of those 21 species, 8 of them were freshwater mussels. So it wasn't just the button industry. There were other things like agricultural runoff and the building of the lock and dams. But these mussels have struggled mightily over time. And things like this industry, I would never say this was a bad thing, because it provided a lot of jobs in this community. It was almost a recession-proof industry for this town and built a lot of the industry that exists here today. But it's always good to learn the lessons too, that sometimes when we make decisions, they have results that we can't know about down the road. So.
Sure. Viewers, we have been visiting with Mr. Dustin Joy, who's the director of the National Pearl Button Museum in Muscatine, Iowa, right along the Mississippi River in southeast Iowa. Would that be correct, Dustin? Yeah. In southeast Iowa? Okay. We hope that you will schedule a tour there, or at least stop and visit the marvelous displays that they have on hand and broaden your knowledge of this fantastic industry. So Dustin, can you please repeat how they might contact you if they want to schedule a visit?
Our website is www.muscatinehistory.org. And my email address is dustin@muscatinehistory.org. We're on 2nd Street in downtown Muscatine, which is just to the southwest of the Quad Cities, if you're familiar with that. We're about 30 minutes south of Interstate 80.
Okay.
If you're traveling the Great River Road, or you just want to see some of the interesting sites along the Mississippi or southeast Iowa, we'd love you to come and pay us a visit, and we'll show you why this history is so interesting.
Thank you, Dustin.
Wonderful. Thank you.
What a pleasure. What a pleasure to visit with you and to learn the story of the National Pearl Button Museum. Jackie, how can you close us?
Yes, viewers, I would like to have you look at your site there and notice the blue dot, the blue thumbs up, that is, and then the red subscribe button. So would you kindly touch those, please? And until next time, we hope that you tune in to the 1950s Fun Chat and tell your friends, even your relatives, about the 1950s Fun Chat.
Yes.
Until then, toodaloo.